The neighborhood had always carried an odd sort of weight to it, the kind of place where manicured lawns seemed more like obligations than personal choices, where the shade of shutters or the precise height of hedges wasn't simply a matter of taste but a matter of law, or at least something very close to it. The Homeowners Association ruled over everything with an iron grip, dressed up in polite newsletters and official-looking letters that slid into mailboxes like summonses. At first, when my wife and I moved in, we thought of it as just one of those quirks of suburban living, annoying, yes, but tolerable, the kind of thing you rolled your eyes at while muttering about, "Wah nonsense," as you complied. We had lived through it peacefully enough for a while, following their rules as best we could, until one woman decided she had found her hill to die on, and that hill was the patch of property we called home. Her name was Karen, and if the WA had an unofficial mascot, she would have been it. It began with little things. Karen was the type who noticed if your trash bins lingered on the curb 10 minutes past the pickup deadline. She had been known to measure the grass of her neighbors with a ruler, literally, then report them for exceeding the regulation to 2¾ inch height. She knew the WA handbook like a priest knows scripture, and she wielded it with a righteousness that bordered on obsession. For months, she seemed content policing the neighborhood in small ways, glaring over hedges, scribbling notes, leaving passive-aggressive comments at WA meetings. But then came the letter that would set everything into motion. One ordinary morning, as the sun was spilling over the rooftops in that sharp, golden way it does early in summer, my wife retrieved the mail. Among the bills and grocery coupons sat an envelope stamped with the WA seal. She opened it casually, not expecting anything beyond the usual community newsletter. Instead, her eyes widened as she unfolded the paper and saw bold print at the top, "Notice of fine." The amount stunned her. It wasn't the usual slap on the wrist $50 penalty or the $100 fee we'd seen levied on others. No, this was a staggering $3,500 fine. The accusation was as ridiculous as the amount. According to the notice, we were being fined for repeated violations of community aesthetics and failure to comply with previous warnings. The specific violations boiled down to the fact that my wife had chosen to plant a row of colorful wildflowers along the edge of our front lawn. They weren't invasive, they weren't overgrown, they weren't harming anyone or anything, but they weren't on the approved WA landscape list. Karen had complained several times at meetings about the flowers being too unruly and bringing down the uniform look of the community. Of course, no one else really cared. In fact, a few neighbors had even complimented them. But Karen was relentless, and now, somehow, she had convinced the WA board, or intimidated them, into backing her vendetta with this outrageous fine. My wife read the letter 3 times over before showing it to me, her hands shaking not with fear but with pure disbelief. $3,500 for flowers, are they insane? She asked, thrusting the paper toward me. I scanned it myself, feeling a slow boil rise in my chest. It wasn't just about the money, though the number was absurd enough to make anyone's blood pressure spike. It was about the principle, the arrogance of assuming that they could demand such a sum over something so trivial. And I knew immediately who was behind it. Karen. We could have paid it, technically. It would have hurt, but it was within our means. And I think that was exactly the point. Karen assumed we would pay because fighting the WA wasn't worth the trouble for most people. They banked on compliance, on people folding under the weight of bureaucracy rather than pushing back. But my wife surprised me that day. She folded the letter back up, slid it into its envelope, and set it aside with a calmness I didn't expect. "I'm not paying this," she said simply. I raised an eyebrow. "They'll just keep hassling us. You know that, right?" "Let them," she replied. I refused to throw away $3,500 just to feed her ego. This is ridiculous, and I won't give her the satisfaction. It wasn't just defiance in her voice, it was resolve. My wife wasn't usually one for confrontation, but something about this fine lit a fire in her. Maybe it was because she had spent weeks tending to those flowers, finding joy in watching them bloom despite the sameness that stretched across every other yard. Maybe it was because she saw through Karen's pettiness, understanding that this wasn't about flowers at all but about control. Whatever it was, she had drawn a line in the sand. Days passed, then weeks, and the ignored fine seemed to gnaw at Karen like an itch she couldn't scratch. We'd catch her standing across the street, arms folded, eyes fixed on our lawn as if it were a crime scene. Sometimes she muttered to herself, sometimes she snapped pictures with her phone, and sometimes she made a show of scribbling furiously into her little notebook. At first, we laughed about it, joking that she probably had a whole dossier honest hidden in her file cabinet. But as her glares grew sharper and her mutterings louder, the situation took on an edge that felt less amusing and more unnerving. Then came the second letter, another demand for payment, this one more aggressive in tone. It warned of further consequences, of potential liens on the property, of escalating penalties. Again, my wife folded it up and set it aside. Let them try, she said, with the kind of determination that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. She wasn't just stubborn, she was principled. And she refused to bow to bullying, even if that bully wore the mask of an official HOA. What we didn't realize then, though, was how far Karen was willing to take things. For her, the ignored fine wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore, it was a personal challenge, a battle she couldn't afford to lose. Each day she passed our house, each time she saw those flowers swaying defiantly in the breeze, it must have gnawed at her pride. She had issued her decree, and we had dared to dismiss it. And for someone like Karen, that was unacceptable. The $3,500 fine was supposed to be the hammer that broke us, the move that would force compliance and cement her authority. But instead, it had become the spark that ignited something much larger. My wife's refusal to pay wasn't just about money anymore, it was a statement. And in Karen's mind, that statement had to be crushed. We didn't know it yet, but the ignored envelope sitting quietly in our drawer was the first domino in a chain reaction that would soon spiral far beyond letters, fines, and flowers. At first, I thought Karen might let it go. After all, people in neighborhoods like ours were used to ignoring small skirmishes with the HOA. A letter here, a warning there, it was part of the background noise of suburban living. But Karen was different. To her, ignoring the fine was more than disobedience, it was defiance. And in her mind, defiance was something that had to be crushed. The ignored envelope sitting in our drawer didn't just irritate her, it consumed her. From that moment on, she made us her personal crusade. It started with letters, not official notices, not neatly typed HOA correspondence with their standard legal jargon, but scribbled notes slid under our doormat or taped to our mailbox. They were short and sharp, written in a hurried scrawl that betrayed her anger. This will not end well if you continue to ignore the rules. You are setting a bad example for the community. Pay the fine before things escalate further. Each note carried a tone that was equal parts threat and smug superiority, as if she thought intimidation would wear us down. My wife collected them at first, tossing them onto the kitchen counter like unwanted flyers. She'd read them with a raised eyebrow, shake her head, and then push them into a drawer. "She's trying to scare us," she said one evening. And I refused to give her that satisfaction. But the notes didn't stop. They became more frequent, almost daily, and the wording grew darker. Karen began invoking legal action, threatening to involve the proper authorities, and seek consequences in court. The irony was sharp. She had no idea who she was threatening, no clue that the man she was vowing to drag into court was someone who spent his life inside one. I could have stepped in then, revealed my position, and shut the whole thing down with a single sentence. But something told me it wasn't time yet. My wife's quiet defiance had a dignity to it, and I didn't want to undermine that. Instead, we watched as Karen tightened her grip on her obsession, feeding it like a fire she couldn't control. The confrontation soon moved from paper to face. Karen seemed to find reasons to be outside whenever we were. If my wife watered her flowers in the morning, Karen would happen to be walking her dog, though the poor animal looked exhausted from the constant charade. She'd stop on the sidewalk, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, and lob barbed comments across the lawn. "Still ignoring official notices, I see. You know you're embarrassing yourselves. People are talking." My wife, to her credit, never gave her the reaction she wanted. She'd smile politely, say nothing, and return to her flowers. The silence infuriated Karen more than any argument could have. One Saturday afternoon, the tension finally spilled over. I was in the garage tinkering with some tools when I heard raised voices outside. I stepped out to see Karen standing at the edge of our driveway, hands planted firmly on her hips, her entire posture vibrating with indignation. My wife stood a few feet away, calm but firm, holding her ground. "You can't just ignore this forever," Karen snapped, her voice carrying loud enough for half the street to hear. "The rules apply to everyone. You think you're above them, but you're not. The board has authority, and you're making a mockery of it." My wife's tone was steady, almost unnervingly calm. "I'm not paying $3,500 for planting flowers, Karen. It's absurd, and you know it. Karen's face flushed red, her jaw tightening as if she wasn't used to being spoken to so directly. She sputtered for a moment, then jabbed a finger toward the lawn. "Those weeds, because that's what they are, ruin the look of this community. We work hard to keep things orderly, and you're tearing it all down." "They're flowers," my wife replied simply. "And plenty of neighbors like them." At that, several blinds on surrounding houses twitched, subtle movements as neighbors peeked out. Karen noticed, and the realization that people were watching only seemed to fuel her fury. She didn't want to be seen losing ground, not in public, not in front of the community she claimed to protect. She straightened her shoulders, adopting the posture of someone issuing a final warning. "If you don't pay the fine immediately, I'll have no choice but to escalate this. You'll regret ignoring me." With that, she stormed off, her dog trotting miserably behind her, clearly used to these outbursts. My wife exhaled, brushing her hands against her jeans as though shaking off the encounter. She turned to me with a wry smile. "She's unraveling." And she was. Over the next few weeks, her obsession only deepened. She began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, whispering about our supposed disrespect for the rules. Some neighbors nodded politely, others shrugged her off, but the damage was done. The air in the community grew heavy with tension. Every walk to the mailbox felt like a silent stage play, neighbors peeking through curtains, gauging whether they should take sides or stay invisible. Most chose the latter, which made the isolation sharper. Karen also grew bolder in her theatrics. She would stand across the street and take pictures of our house, sometimes crouching like a detective at a crime scene, snapping angles of the flowers, the lawn, even our cars. Once, I caught her photographing my wife as she stepped out of the front door, and when I confronted her, she claimed it was documentation for the record. The sheer absurdity of it would have been laughable if not for the venom in her tone. Her obsession wasn't just directed at us, it infected the entire neighborhood. Where once kids rode bikes freely down the cul-de-sac, now parents ushered them inside at the sight of Karen's figure marching across the sidewalk. Conversations at block gatherings grew hushed when she arrived, the tension palpable, everyone aware of her fixation but too wary to intervene. She had turned our little standoff into a silent spectacle, and the whole community was caught in its pull. Through it all, my wife remained remarkably steady. She ignored the letters, endured the comments, and carried on with her daily routines. But I could see the toll in small ways, the sighs she tried to hide when yet another note appeared, the way she hesitated at the window when Karen lingered outside too long, the slight tension in her shoulders when neighbors avoided eye contact. Defiance was one thing, living under constant surveillance was another. Still, she refused to bend. And Karen, in her growing frustration, began to look for a bigger weapon. Letters hadn't worked, confrontations hadn't broken us, the neighborhood whispers hadn't isolated us enough. She needed something louder, something official, something that would force us into submission. I didn't know it yet, but Karen had already begun planning her next move, a move that would take this petty suburban feud into territory neither of us expected. She had played her hand as far as the WA rules allowed. Now, she was ready to bring in outsiders. Karen was about to call the police. By the time midsummer rolled in, Karen had exhausted nearly every tool in her self-appointed arsenal. The letters hadn't worked, the warnings hadn't scared us. Her attempts to rally the neighborhood had fizzled out, leaving only a few lukewarm supporters and a growing number of silent critics who were tired of her antics. But if there was one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was being ignored. Each day she saw those flowers blooming in defiance, each time she spotted my wife walking past her with a calm smile, it chipped away at her sense of authority. For a woman like her, power wasn't just a comfort, it was oxygen. And she was suffocating. So, one sweltering afternoon, when the air was thick enough to make the asphalt shimmer and cicadas screamed from the trees, Karen decided she needed reinforcements. She wasn't going to let this become her loss, not in front of the entire neighborhood. To her, the stakes had become bigger than flowers or fines. It was about dominance, about proving that her word carried weight. That was the day she picked up the phone and dialed the police. We didn't know right away, of course. We were inside, enjoying the weak hum of the air conditioner and the luxury of a rare quiet day. My wife was reading by the window, her legs tucked up on the couch, while I sifted through some paperwork in the kitchen. The first clue came in the form of a shadow moving past the blinds, followed by the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights reflecting faintly against the living room wall. My wife looked up, frowning. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing toward the window. I walked over and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. 2 police cruisers had pulled up along the curb, their presence breaking the monotony of our sleepy street. A small knot of neighbors had already gathered at a safe distance, drawn out by curiosity, whispering and pointing in that way people do when they smell drama but don't want to be caught in the middle of it. And at the center of it all, standing tall with a smug tilt to her chin, was Karen. She was speaking animatedly to one of the officers, gesturing toward our house as though she were exposing a den of criminals. Even from behind the glass, I could see the fervor in her movements, the self-righteous fire burning in her expression. She had finally escalated the situation in the way only Karen could, by treating a neighborly dispute like a criminal offense. "They're here for us," I said quietly, almost in disbelief. My wife set her book aside, her brow furrowed but her demeanor steady. "Of course they are. She's finally done it." We waited as the officers listened to Karen's tirade. They nodded occasionally, jotting notes into little pads, but their body language suggested this wasn't exactly the emergency call they had been expecting. Still, protocol demanded they take her seriously, and that meant, inevitably, they would come to our door. Sure enough, a few minutes later, there was a firm knock at the front. Not aggressive, but official, the kind of knock that carried authority even before a word was spoken. My wife and I exchanged a glance. "Let me handle this," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could see the steel behind her eyes. She wasn't going to back down now, not after weeks of enduring Karen's harassment. When she opened the door, the 2 officers stood tall in their pressed uniforms, the heat of the afternoon glistening off their brows. Behind them, Karen hovered just out of earshot, straining to look as dignified as possible, though the smug curve of her lips betrayed her anticipation of victory. "Ma'am," one officer began politely, "we received a complaint regarding a violation of community regulations." The HOA president, he glanced briefly over his shoulder at Karen, informed us that you've been issued repeated fines and have failed to comply. My wife tilted her head, her expression neutral but laced with quiet amusement. "And she called the police for that." The officer cleared his throat, clearly aware of the absurdity but bound by duty to follow through. "Well, we're here to understand the situation. Are you aware of the fine?" "Yes," my wife replied evenly. "We received it, and we chose not to pay it because it's ridiculous. $3,500 for planting flowers. That's not a crime, officer. That's abuse of power." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner as if to say she has a point. Still, they pressed on, their voices measured. "We're not here to make judgments about the HOA's policies, ma'am. Our role is simply to ensure there isn't a disturbance." At that, my wife's composure sharpened, her chin lifting slightly. "The only disturbance here is the one standing on my curb, wasting your time and mine. Look around you. Does this look like a crime scene? Or does it look like a neighbor who can't stand the fact that someone told her no?" The words landed heavily, and even the officers couldn't completely hide the flicker of agreement in their expressions. Behind them, Karen bristled, stepping forward. "They're liars," she snapped, her voice cracking with indignation. "They've ignored official notices, they're disrespecting the law, and they're setting a bad example for everyone here. If you don't force them to comply, then what's the point of rules at all?" Her outburst turned heads among the gathered neighbors, who whispered more fervently now. Some shook their heads, others smirked. The longer this went on, the more Karen seemed to unravel in front of an unintended audience. But in her mind, this was her moment of triumph, and she wasn't about to let it slip. "Ma'am," one officer said carefully, "this is not a criminal matter. The police can't enforce HOA fines. If you have a dispute, it needs to be handled through civil channels." The color drained from Karen's face, replaced almost instantly with a furious flush. "So you're just going to let them get away with it?" she demanded, her voice rising. "They're breaking the rules, and you're siding with them." The officer sighed, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "We're not siding with anyone. But this is not within our jurisdiction. If you want to pursue it, you'll need to take it up in court." And there it was, the first crack in Karen's perfect facade. She had called the police expecting them to march onto our lawn, slap us with threats, maybe even force us to comply on the spot. Instead, she was being told, in front of the very neighbors she sought to impress, that her crusade had no legal teeth. For a moment, she looked like she might explode. Her fists clenched at her sides, her lips trembled with words she couldn't form, and her eyes darted between the officers, my wife, and the watching neighbors. Inside, I remained silent, watching through the doorway. I could have stepped forward then, could have revealed my role in the legal system and ended the charade in a single, devastating sentence. But it wasn't the right moment yet. Not while Karen was still scrambling, not while the suspense hung heavy in the humid air. The officers offered polite nods, their patience wearing thin, and turned to leave. Karen, however, lingered, her face contorted with disbelief. She wasn't used to being told no, not by the HOA board, not by neighbors, and certainly not by authority figures. But now she had been denied by the very police she thought would cement her power. It wasn't just a defeat, it was humiliation. And humiliation, for Karen, was gasoline on the fire of obsession. As the cruisers pulled away and the small crowd of neighbors dispersed, my wife closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. "She's not done," she said quietly. "That stunt didn't work, so she'll try something else." I nodded, watching Karen's retreating figure as she marched back toward her house, her shoulders stiff, her steps sharp with rage. My wife was right. Karen had played her biggest card and lost. The question wasn't whether she would strike again, it was how. And what we didn't know yet was that her next attempt wouldn't just be about rules or flowers or fines. It would drag us into a confrontation where identities would be revealed, and the balance of power would shift in a way no one on that street could have predicted. Karen had called the cops. But the real shock was still waiting. The next few days after the police visit felt heavy, like the entire street was holding its breath. Karen had been humiliated, and anyone who knew her could tell she wasn't the kind of person to lick her wounds quietly. She thrived on control, on bending people to her will, and when the officers told her flatly that they couldn't enforce HOA fines, it had shaken the foundation of her self-image. For most people, that would have been the end. But Karen wasn't most people. She had turned our little patch of lawn into her battleground, and she wasn't about to surrender. We didn't have to wait long. By midweek, the rumblings began again. Neighbors whispered that Karen was calling board members late at night, demanding that they back her up. Someone even claimed they heard her shouting over the phone about making an example out of us. She wanted to prove to the whole community that no one could defy her authority, not even for something as harmless as flowers. And then, one warm Thursday evening, her next move arrived. This time, the knock at the door was harder, sharper, carrying an edge of impatience that rattled through the wooden frame. When I opened it, 2 officers stood on the porch again, different ones from before, younger, with the kind of rigid posture that comes from wanting to do everything by the book. Behind them, Karen hovered with her arms folded, her mouth curved into the tightest, most self-satisfied smirk I had ever seen. She looked like a cat that had dragged home a prize, convinced she'd finally cornered us. "Sir," one of the officers began, his tone clipped but professional, "we've received another complaint from your HOA representative. We'd like to discuss it with you and your wife." Karen interjected before I could answer. "They've been blatantly ignoring the rules for months. I've given them notice after notice. They mock the HOA, they mock me, and now they're mocking the law. Enough is enough. Something needs to be done tonight." Her voice cracked with triumph, as if she believed this was the moment justice would finally bend in her favor. She didn't even glance at me when she spoke, as though I were invisible, as though the officers were her private enforcers summoned to carry out her will. My wife stepped up beside me, folding her arms calmly, her face unreadable. "Officers," she said evenly, "we've already explained this. There's no crime here. The HOA can't call the police every time a neighbor disagrees with them." One of the officers shifted, glancing at his partner. "We understand, ma'am, but since the complaint was filed, we have to follow up. We'll need to hear your side before we determine how to proceed." Karen jumped back in, her words sharp as knives. "Her side doesn't matter. They've been fined. They ignored it. That's the end of the story. If you let people get away with this, then the rules mean nothing. I won't stand by while this community falls apart because they think they're special." Her voice rose with every sentence, carrying down the block. Once again, blinds twitched open. Porch lights clicked on. Neighbors stepped quietly into their driveways, pretending to check mailboxes or water lawns but really there to watch. Karen wanted a scene, and now she had one. I watched the officers carefully. At first, they leaned toward Karen's side, if only because she was loud and persistent. They nodded at her claims, scribbled notes, and spoke to her with the kind of deferential politeness you give someone who won't stop until you do. My wife and I stayed still, letting her dig herself deeper with each breath. She was desperate for them to act, to march into our home, to handcuff us or haul us off or do something, anything, that would re-establish her as the power in this little corner of suburbia. Finally, one of the officers turned back to us. "Is it true that you've ignored HOA fines?" "Yes," my wife said without hesitation. "Because they're unjust. $3,500 for planting flowers isn't a rule, it's harassment. We've explained this before, and frankly, I don't think you need to waste any more time on this." Karen gasped as though my wife had spat on the Constitution. "Harassment," she shrieked. "You're the ones destroying everything we've built here. This neighborhood has standards. Without people like me enforcing them, you'd all be living in chaos." Her face twisted as she spoke, red blotches blooming across her cheeks, her words half scream, half plea. It was as if she wasn't just fighting us anymore, she was fighting the entire idea that anyone could resist her control. The officers tried to calm her down, raising their hands, but she barreled on, pointing at us like an accuser in a courtroom. "They think they're untouchable. They think the rules don't apply to them. But you can fix this. You can finally put them in their place." The irony of her words nearly made me laugh, but I bit it back. I could feel my wife's tension beside me, though her expression remained steady, her silence deliberate. We had agreed to wait. Wait until Karen pushed too far, until the moment when her arrogance tipped into absurdity. The reveal would come soon enough. For now, we let the officers question us. They asked about the flowers, the letters, the fines. We answered honestly, calmly, while Karen interrupted at every turn, her voice growing shriller as her composure unraveled. The more she spoke, the more ridiculous she sounded. Neighbors shifted in their yards, whispering, shaking their heads. Some smiled knowingly, as though they could sense what was coming, even if they didn't know the details. Finally, one officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Ms. Karen," she snapped. "Karen Simmons, HOA Vice President." "Right," he said, clearly tired. "Ms. Simmons, we understand your concerns, but this is still a civil matter. It's not something the police can resolve tonight. If you feel strongly, you'll need to take it to court." Karen's face contorted with rage. "Court, court, why should I have to go through all that when you can end this right now? You're officers of the law, you have authority. Use it." Her shrill demand hung in the air, echoing off the quiet houses. The officers glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable, as if realizing just how far she had spiraled. My wife placed a gentle hand on my arm, her subtle signal. "Not yet, but soon." I looked at Karen, then at the officers, then at the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered in the shadows. Everyone was waiting for something to break, for the shouting to stop, for the truth to surface, for the balance of power to finally shift. And though Karen couldn't see it, her desperation had already tipped the scales. She had played every card she had, and still, we hadn't bent. This was the confrontation she wanted, but not the one she would win. Because soon, the question the officer would ask, the one that would freeze him in his tracks, would unravel everything Karen thought she knew. For now, though, we stood calmly on our porch, letting her rage echo through the summer night, letting her think she still held the upper hand. The truth was coming, and when it did, Karen's smug certainty would collapse into stunned silence. The unexpected confrontation wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The night air was thick with Karen's rage, her voice sharp enough to cut through the humid quiet that hung over the neighborhood. The officers, who had come expecting to handle a simple complaint, were now caught in the middle of her tirade, their patience wearing thinner by the minute. My wife stood beside me, calm and resolute, her silence both a shield and a weapon. I had stayed quiet through all of this, watching Karen puff herself up, watching the officers struggle between politeness and irritation, and watching the neighbors' growing curiosity as the spectacle unfolded under the glow of porch lights. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, for someone to end the stalemate. One officer finally raised a hand, his tone firm. "Ms. Simmons, we've explained that this is not a criminal matter. There's nothing here for the police to enforce." Karen nearly exploded at that. Her face turned crimson, her voice rising to a pitch that made the crowd of neighbors shift uncomfortably. "So that's it, you're just going to walk away? They mock the rules, mock this community, and now they're mocking you. How can you stand there and do nothing?" The officer sighed, glancing back at me and my wife, perhaps searching for an anchor of sanity in this storm. "Sir, ma'am, is there anything you'd like to add before we leave?" That was the moment. The signal had come earlier from my wife's hand on my arm, her subtle way of telling me it was time. I had remained in the background long enough, letting Karen dig herself into a pit so deep that no rope could pull her out. Now, with the office's eyes on me and the neighbors straining to hear, I stepped forward, my voice calm but deliberate. "Yes," I said, "there's something I should probably mention. I'm not just a homeowner here. I'm a sitting judge with the county court." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, silence rippled outward across the entire street. The officers froze, their pens hovering midair, their expressions flipping from weary disinterest to startled recognition. One of them blinked rapidly, as though replaying my words in his head to make sure he hadn't misheard. The other straightened immediately, his demeanor shifting in an instant from casual investigator to professional deference. You're a judge?" he asked, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and sudden respect. I nodded. "Yes, which means I'm very familiar with what is and isn't enforceable by law. And I can assure you, officers, HOA fines don't fall under your jurisdiction. This is a civil matter, one that Ms. Simmons has grossly exaggerated to waste your time and ours." Behind them, Karen let out a sound that was half gasp, half sputter. Her smug posture collapsed into visible panic, her arms falling slack at her sides. "Wait, what, a judge? You can't be serious." Her eyes darted between me and the officers, her certainty crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. She had expected me to be just another stubborn neighbor, someone she could bully into submission. The revelation that I was not only legally informed but carried authority of my own was a blow she hadn't seen coming. The first officer cleared his throat, his voice far more measured now. "Your Honor, we had no idea." His words carried weight, an almost instinctive respect that made the neighbors lean closer, their whispers growing louder. Karen stammered, trying to gather the pieces of her shattered confidence. This doesn't change the fact that they broke the rules. Judge or not, the HOA is in charge here. The fine is valid. You can't just ignore it." But her voice had lost its conviction. It cracked under the pressure of the truth pressing down on her. Everyone could see it, the shift in the air, the sudden imbalance of power. Where she once stood puffed up with authority, now she looked small, desperate, like a child caught in a lie. I turned my gaze on her, my tone still calm but now edged with the authority she had underestimated. "Karen, you've wasted police resources on a personal vendetta. That, in itself, could be considered harassment. You've stood here for weeks pretending you're the guardian of this community, but what you've really done is abuse your position. These officers have real work to do, work that actually protects people. Not this." The officers nodded, almost relieved that someone had finally said what they couldn't. One of them even shot Karen a look that was equal parts irritation and pity. The neighbors, no longer hiding their reactions, murmured openly. Some shook their heads, others smirked, and a few even chuckled quietly. The tide had turned completely, and Karen could feel it. She tried one last time, her voice trembling with desperation. You can't turn everyone against me. I was just trying to protect the community." But the words rang hollow, bouncing off the silence that followed. Protecting the community had never been her goal, it had always been about control, about feeding the fragile ego that now lay exposed under the weight of her failure. The second officer stepped forward, his voice firm. "Ms. Simmons, we strongly advise you to stop making unnecessary calls to law enforcement. If you have a dispute, you'll need to resolve it in civil court. But we will not continue responding to matters like this. Do you understand?" Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, her face flushed with shame. She gave the smallest of nods, her voice barely a whisper. "Fine." The officers turned back to me, their tone respectful. "Your Honor, we apologize for the disturbance. Thank you for your patience." I inclined my head. "Thank you, officers. I know this wasn't the kind of call you expected." As they walked back to their cruisers, the small crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, but not without stealing glances at Karen, whose once commanding presence now looked broken and brittle. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at the ground, her confidence stripped away in full view of the very people she had wanted to impress. My wife closed the door gently, then turned to me with a small smile that carried both relief and triumph. "Well," she said, "I don't think she saw that coming." I couldn't help but laugh, the tension of weeks finally breaking. "No, I don't think she did." Karen had played her biggest card, but in the end, it had been turned back on her. The power she thought she held had vanished in a single moment of truth, and now, for the first time, she was the one left powerless. The neighborhood had seen it. The officers had seen it. And she had seen it most of all. The game was over. The street was quieter than usual the next morning, though I could feel an unspoken energy rippling beneath the stillness. Word had traveled fast. In neighborhoods like ours, stories didn't just spread, they multiplied, reshaped by whispers over fences, murmurs at mailboxes, and late-night conversations in softly lit kitchens. And now, the story everyone wanted to talk about was how Karen, self-appointed enforcer of the law, had been silenced in front of the entire block. When I stepped outside to fetch the paper, the air was crisp with the faint promise of rain, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the prickling weight of Karen's eyes on me. Her curtains, usually twitching open whenever we so much as stepped onto our porch, remained stubbornly shut. The house looked different somehow, not physically but in spirit, less a command post, more a bunker. She was hiding, licking her wounds, and the absence of her presence was louder than her voice had ever been. The neighbors, however, were anything but quiet. As I walked back toward the house, one of them, Mr. Douglas, who lived 3 doors down, gave me a little nod. It wasn't much, just a tilt of his head, but it carried meaning. Respect, approval, a silent acknowledgement of what had unfolded. Later that day, Mrs. Ramirez, who had always kept her distance from neighborhood politics, stopped my wife during her walk and offered a smile. "Those flowers of yours are beautiful," she said softly, her tone carrying more weight than the words themselves. In a community where everyone watched but few dared to speak, these small gestures spoke volumes. Karen, on the other hand, had been stripped of her armor. She didn't march the sidewalks with her clipboard anymore. She didn't snap pictures of our lawn or measure the height of grass blades in other yards. She had vanished into the background, a ghost of her former self. When she did appear, usually in hurried trips from her car to her door, she avoided eye contact, her head lowered, her once commanding stride reduced to a hurried shuffle. For someone who had thrived on control, the loss of it was a kind of exile. The wall itself tried to save face, though it was clear Karen's shadow loomed over every decision. At the next board meeting, which my wife attended just out of curiosity, there was no mention of the $3,500 fine, no acknowledgement of the fiasco with the police. Instead, the board members danced around the subject, filling the agenda with mundane updates about landscaping contracts and community events. But their discomfort was obvious. Karen sat in the back, unusually silent, her face tight with the effort of pretending nothing had happened. When the meeting ended, she slipped out without speaking, her usual domineering presence reduced to nothing more than a flicker in the room. For us, the change was immediate. The notes stopped arriving, the glares disappeared, the constant weight of surveillance lifted, replaced by a peace we hadn't realized we'd missed. We sat on our porch in the evenings, sipping iced tea while the sun dipped low, and for the first time in months, we felt like the house was truly ours again, not just a battlefield in someone else's war. But as the relief settled in, so did reflection. What struck me most wasn't Karen's fall from grace, it was how close we had come to letting her consume us. She had wielded her authority like a weapon, convinced the rules made her untouchable, and in many ways, she had succeeded in bending the neighborhood to her will. For weeks, we'd been living under her shadow, our choices dictated not by what we wanted but by how she might respond. That was the danger of people like Karen. It wasn't just the rules, it was the fear, the silence, the way they turned neighbors into passive bystanders. My wife, ever perceptive, voiced it one evening as we sat outside, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. "You know what the real problem is," she said, her gaze steady on the blooms that had started this whole mess. "It's not the HOA. Not really. It's people like her, who take a little bit of power and twist it until it's something ugly. And everyone else lets them, because fighting back feels harder than just giving in." She was right. The HOA was just a framework. On paper, it was about maintaining standards, preserving property values, keeping the community tidy. But in the wrong hands, that framework became a throne. Karen had climbed onto it, convinced she was queen of the cul-de-sac, and for too long, everyone had played along. The irony was that in the end, it hadn't taken a dramatic fight or a shouting match to topple her. It had only taken the truth, calmly, firmly delivered at exactly the right moment. A single revelation had stripped away her power, exposing her bluster for what it was. The neighbors had seen it. The officers had seen it. And most painfully for Karen, she had seen it too. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normalcy. Children rode their bikes down the street again without Karen snapping photos of their reckless behavior. Neighbors chatted casually over fences without worrying she might twist their words into ammunition. Even the board seemed more subdued, as though wary of pushing too hard after the spectacle. It was as if the entire community had taken a deep breath it didn't know it had been holding. And yet, there was still a lesson lingering in the air, one I carried with me each time I saw Karen's drawn curtains or heard the faint sound of her dog barking from behind her closed doors. Power, I realized, doesn't have to be granted formally to be dangerous. Sometimes it only takes one determined voice, loud enough and persistent enough, to bend a community to its will. But the moment that voice is challenged, the illusion shatters. One evening, about a month later, as the sky turned dusky purple and fireflies began to spark in the grass, I caught sight of Karen again. She was standing in her yard, clutching her dog's leash, her posture stiff but not defiant. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no anger there, no smug superiority. Just weariness. She looked away quickly, tugging her dog back inside, but the image lingered with me. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was just another neighbor, stripped of the crown she had forged out of rules and fear. My wife joined me on the porch, following my gaze. "She's not the same," she said quietly. "No," I agreed, "but maybe that's for the best." We sat in silence for a while, watching the flowers sway under the twilight sky. They had survived the storm, just as we had, their colors bright against the fading light. And in that simple, ordinary moment, I realized that sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud or dramatic. Sometimes, they're as quiet as a neighborhood finally at peace, and as small as a patch of wildflowers blooming freely in the front yard. Karen's reign was over, and life had moved on. But the memory of it, the lesson of it, remained. Power could corrupt, fear could silence, but truth, delivered calmly and firmly, could cut through it all. And for us, that was enough.